Imagine standing in a room full of the most powerful military minds, watching a three-star general's face drain of all color as he stares at a young soldier who just walked in. The general's hand, which was raised to deliver what everyone expected to be a career-ending reprimand, slowly drops to his side. His voice, known for commanding respect across entire battalions, barely manages a whisper. Stand down. What could make a man who has faced enemy fire, commanded thousands of troops, and earned his stars through decades of unwavering strength, suddenly freeze, like he's seen a ghost? What secret lies behind that shaved head and those familiar eyes that just walked through the door? Some stories unfold on battlefields. Others happen in the quiet corners of military bases where the real battles are fought between duty and family, between the person you were and the soldier you've become. This is one of those stories that proves sometimes the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is simply the truth. The young soldier standing at attention had no idea that walking into that briefing room would change not just their own life, but shake the very foundation of everything. A respected general thought he knew about sacrifice, honor, and the price of serving your country. Get ready for a story that will make you question everything you think you know about what it really means to serve, to sacrifice, and to find your way back home. General Marcus Sullivan had seen it all in his 32 years of military service. He had commanded troops through 3 major conflicts, earned medals that most soldiers only dream of, and built a reputation as one of the most respected leaders in the entire armed forces. His office walls were covered with commendations, photographs with presidents, and battle maps from operations that had shaped modern military history. At 54, he was at the peak of his career, respected by superiors and feared by subordinates who knew that disappointing the general meant facing consequences that could end careers. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Sullivan arrived at Fort Braxton at precisely 5:30, as he had every day for the past 4 years since taking command of the base. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Carolina hills, casting long shadows across the training grounds, where young recruits were already running their morning drills. He could hear the rhythmic cadence of their boots hitting the pavement, the sharp commands of drill sergeants, and the occasional sound of equipment being moved across the base. These sounds had become the soundtrack of his life, as familiar as his own heartbeat. Sullivan poured his black coffee and reviewed the day's schedule. There was a disciplinary hearing at 10, a budget meeting with Pentagon officials at 2, and the weekly inspection of new recruits at 4. Between meetings, he had dozens of reports to review, personnel decisions to make, and the constant stream of problems that seemed to find their way to his desk. Being a general meant being responsible for thousands of lives, millions of dollars in equipment, and decisions that could affect national security. It was a weight he carried gladly, but a weight nonetheless. The disciplinary hearing was routine, also Sullivan thought. Private Jamie Rodriguez had been caught breaking curfew for the 3rd time in 2 weeks. Rodriguez was young, barely 19, and clearly struggling with the transition from civilian life to military discipline. Sullivan had seen thousands of soldiers like Rodriguez over the years, young people who joined the military for various reasons, but found the reality harder than they expected. Some adapted and thrived. Others struggled and eventually found different paths. A few, like Rodriguez, seemed to hover somewhere in between, testing boundaries and pushing limits. Sullivan entered the hearing room at exactly 10 o'clock. The room was stark and efficient, with fluorescent lights that cast everything in harsh clarity. A long table dominated the space, with chairs arranged for the disciplinary panel on one side, and a single chair facing them for the accused soldier. The American flag stood in one corner, and regulations posters covered the walls, reminding everyone present of the standards expected of military personnel. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson was already seated, shuffling through Rodriguez's file. Major Williams sat beside him, her expression serious as she reviewed the charges. Sergeant First Class Thompson, who would present the case against Rodriguez, stood near the door with a folder thick with documentation. These hearings happened regularly, and everyone knew their roles. Sullivan would listen to the evidence, consider the soldier's record and circumstances, and make a decision that balanced discipline with fairness. "Send in Private Rodriguez," Sullivan commanded, settling into his chair at the head of the table. The door opened, and a young soldier stepped inside, moving with the careful precision that came from months of military training. The soldier stood at attention, shoulders square, chin up, eyes fixed on a point above Sullivan's head, as regulations demanded. Everything about the posture screamed military discipline, from the perfectly pressed uniform to the spit-shined boots that reflected the overhead lights. Sullivan looked up from the file he was reviewing, ready to begin the formal proceedings that would determine Rodriguez's immediate future in the military. But when his eyes focused on the soldier standing before him, the words he was about to speak died in his throat. The face staring straight ahead was painfully familiar. The bone structure, the set of the jaw, the way the soldier held their shoulders, it all crashed over Sullivan like a wave of memory so powerful it left him momentarily breathless. But it was the eyes that sealed it. Even though they were focused somewhere above his head in the traditional military stance, Sullivan could see enough to know. Those were Sarah's eyes. Sarah Sullivan, his daughter. His little girl who used to climb on his lap when he came home from deployment, who cried when he had to leave for another assignment, who stopped talking to him 3 years ago when their relationship finally shattered under the weight of too many missed birthdays, too many broken promises, and too many arguments about who she was becoming versus who he thought she should be. The last time he had seen Sarah, she had long auburn hair that she wore in intricate braids, a style she had maintained since high school. She had been wearing civilian clothes, torn jeans and a band t-shirt that he disapproved of, and they had been screaming at each other in the driveway of the family home. The fight had been about her future, about his expectations, about choices that seemed impossible to reconcile. She had stormed off that night, and despite his wife Margaret's pleas for him to call, to apologize, to find some way to bridge the gap between them, Sullivan's pride had kept him silent. Now, 3 years later, she was standing in front of him in military uniform, her hair buzzed down to regulation length, her entire appearance transformed into that of a soldier. Private J. Rodriguez, according to the file. She had enlisted under her middle name, Josephine, and taken her mother's maiden name. She had become someone he didn't recognize, while simultaneously becoming more familiar than ever. The silence in the room stretched on. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Sullivan with confusion. Major Williams looked between the general and the private, clearly sensing something was wrong, but unable to identify what. Sergeant Thompson cleared his throat softly, waiting for the general to begin the proceedings. Sullivan tried to speak, tried to fall back on the military training and discipline that had carried him through countless difficult situations, but found himself unable to form words. His daughter, was standing at attention in front of him, waiting to be disciplined for infractions that, in the grand scheme of their relationship, seemed impossibly trivial. How long had she been here? How had she ended up at his base? Of all the military installations in the world, had she known? Had she requested this assignment? Was this some attempt to reconnect, or just the cruelest coincidence imaginable? The questions raced through his mind as he stared at Sarah, at Private Rodriguez, trying to reconcile the image before him with his memories of the angry young woman who had walked out of his life. The military had changed her, just as it had changed him decades ago. The soft curves of her face had been replaced by the lean hardness that came from rigorous physical training. Her posture spoke of discipline and strength. Even the way she breathed seemed controlled, measured, military. But beneath all the changes, she was still his daughter. Still the little girl who used to wear his dog tags around her neck when he was deployed, pretending to be a soldier herself. Still the teenager who had once told him she wanted to follow in his footsteps, before their relationship had deteriorated into the kind of warfare that left no winners. General, Peterson's voice cut through his thoughts. Should we begin? Sullivan realized he had been staring for what must have been a full minute. Everyone in the room was looking at him now, waiting for him to take control of the situation, as he always did. But for the first time in his career, General Marcus Sullivan had no idea what to do next. He looked at his daughter again, noting the way she maintained her military bearing, even though he was certain she had recognized him too. There was something in the set of her jaw, a slight tension that hadn't been there when she first walked in, that told him she knew exactly who was sitting across from her. "Stand down," Sullivan heard himself say, his voice barely above a whisper. The words came out without conscious thought, an automatic response that seemed to spring from some deeper part of himself that was more father than general. It wasn't the formal beginning to a disciplinary hearing. It wasn't following protocol. It was the voice of a man who had just been confronted with the most important person in his life, a person he thought he had lost forever. Peterson looked at him with obvious confusion. "Sir?" Sullivan's hand was shaking as he set down the file. 3 years of silence. 3 years of wondering where she was, what she was doing, whether she was safe. 3 years of pride and stubbornness keeping him from picking up the phone. And now she was here, in his command, under his authority, and he had no idea how to be both her father and her commanding officer. The room remained silent, everyone waiting for direction from the general, who always knew what to do next. But all Sullivan could think about was the last thing Sarah had said to him before she left. "You chose the military over your family a long time ago, Dad. Don't pretend you care now." Looking at her now, seeing the soldier she had become, He realized that maybe she had been wrong. Maybe they had both been wrong about a lot of things. And maybe, just maybe, this impossible coincidence was a chance to find out what was left of the relationship they had once shared. But first, he had to figure out how to breathe again. The silence in the disciplinary hearing room stretched until it became uncomfortable for everyone except the two people who mattered most. Sarah maintained her military stance, but Sullivan could see the slight tremor in her hands, the almost imperceptible shift in her breathing that told him she was fighting to maintain her composure. He knew her well enough, even after 3 years, to recognize the signs of her internal struggle. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson cleared his throat again, more pointedly this time. "General Sullivan, should we proceed with the hearing?" Sullivan forced himself to look away from his daughter and face his subordinates. Each face reflected varying degrees of confusion and concern. They had never seen their commanding officer lose his composure, and the uncertainty in the room was palpable. These were career military personnel who depended on clear leadership and decisive action. His moment of recognition had disrupted the careful order that military proceedings required. "Postpone this hearing," Sullivan said, his voice regaining some of its usual authority. "I need to review the case more thoroughly." Major Williams frowned. "Sir, the case seems straightforward. 3 violations of curfew, clear documentation, witness statements. Private Rodriguez's record shows a pattern of minor infractions." "I said postpone it." The steel in Sullivan's voice left no room for argument. "Schedule it for next week. I want a complete review of Private Rodriguez's service record, training evaluations, and any relevant circumstances that might affect this case." Peterson and Williams exchanged glances but nodded. They had learned long ago not to question the general's decisions even when they didn't understand them. Sergeant Thompson gathered his papers, clearly frustrated that his carefully prepared case would have to wait. "Private Rodriguez," Sullivan said, his voice carefully neutral. "You're dismissed. Return to your duties and report to my office at 1800 hours. Sarah's eyes flickered for just a moment, meeting his directly for the first time since she had entered the room. In that brief contact, Sullivan saw surprise, wariness, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Then she was back to military protocol, saluting crisply. "Yes, sir." Her voice was steady, professional, giving nothing away. As the room emptied, Sullivan remained seated, staring at the door through which his daughter had just walked. The familiar sounds of the base continued outside. Vehicles moving, orders being shouted, the constant activity of military life. But inside the hearing room, everything felt different. The carefully constructed world he had built around his military identity was suddenly complicated by the intrusion of his personal life. He spent the rest of the day trying to function normally, but his mind kept wandering to Sarah. During the budget meeting with Pentagon officials, he found himself wondering how long she had been in the military, what had driven her to enlist, and why she had chosen to use her mother's maiden name. During the afternoon inspection, he caught himself scanning the faces of young recruits, looking for any sign of his daughter among them. Margaret. He needed to call Margaret. His wife had maintained contact with Sarah despite the rift between father and daughter. She had been the bridge between them, carrying messages that neither Sullivan nor Sarah were too proud to deliver directly. Margaret had begged him countless times to reach out, to apologize, to find some way to repair the relationship. Each time, Sullivan had told himself he would call tomorrow, next week, when things were less busy, when he figured out what to say. But he had never called. And now Sarah was here, wearing the same uniform he wore, serving in the same military he had dedicated his life to. The irony was not lost on him. The daughter who had accused him of choosing the military over his family had chosen the military herself. The hours until 1800 moved with agonizing slowness. Sullivan cancelled his usual evening meeting with his senior staff and sat in his office staring at Sarah's service file. She had enlisted 18 months ago, completed basic training with honours, and been assigned to communications. Her performance evaluations were solid but not exceptional. The infractions noted in her record were all minor: the curfew violations, a uniform inspection failure, tardiness to formation. Nothing that indicated serious problems, just the kind of adjustments issues that many young soldiers experienced. But reading between the lines, Sullivan could see patterns that concerned him. The infractions had increased over the past 2 months. Her performance ratings, while still acceptable, had declined slightly. There were notes from her immediate supervisors about attitude issues and apparent difficulty with authority figures. To an outside observer, Private Rodriguez looked like a soldier struggling with military life. To her father, she looked like a young woman wrestling with something much deeper. At exactly 1800 hours, there was a knock on his office door. Sullivan had been a general long enough to recognize the sound of military precise knocking. 3 sharp raps, evenly spaced, confident but respectful. "Enter," he called. Sarah stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Without the formal atmosphere of the hearing room in the presence of other personnel, the moment felt intensely personal despite their military surroundings. She moved to stand at attention in front of his desk, but Sullivan gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, Sarah." The use of her real name broke whatever pretense they had been maintaining. Sarah's shoulders sagged slightly, and for a moment, she looked less like a soldier and more like the daughter he remembered. But she remained standing. "With respect, sir, I prefer to stand." The formality stung, but Sullivan understood it. She was protecting herself, maintaining the distance that rank and protocol provided. In the military structure, she was a private, and he was a general. That hierarchy was easier to navigate than the complicated relationship between an estranged father and daughter. "How long have you known?" Sullivan asked. "Known what, sir?" "Don't play games with me, Sarah. How long have you known you were assigned to my base?" She was quiet for a long moment, and Sullivan could see her internal debate. Finally, she met his eyes directly. 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Sullivan felt something twist in his chest. "You've been here 6 weeks, and you didn't what? Didn't run to Daddy's office for special treatment? Didn't ask for favors because of who my father is?" The professional mask slipped, and suddenly she sounded like the angry young woman who had left home 3 years ago. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." Sarah's voice was tight with controlled emotion. "I've worked hard to be here on my own merit. I requested assignment here specifically because I wanted to prove that I could succeed in your world without your help." "My world?" "The military. The thing that was always more important than family dinners, school plays, birthday parties, or any of the other things that normal fathers care about." The accusation hit Sullivan like a physical blow. He had heard variations of it before, during their final fight 3 years ago, but somehow it stung more now. Maybe because she was wearing the same uniform that had taken him away from those dinners and plays. Maybe because she had chosen to join the institution that had driven them apart. "Is that why you enlisted? To prove a point?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "At first, maybe. I was angry, and I wanted to show you that I could be everything you wanted me to be. I thought maybe if I became a soldier, you would finally be proud of me." "I was always proud of you. Were you? Because all I remember are the fights about my grades, my friends, my choices. All I remember is feeling like nothing I did was ever good enough for the great General Sullivan." Sullivan felt the weight of every missed moment, every time he had chosen duty over family, every conversation that had ended in disappointment on both sides. The successes that had defined his military career suddenly seemed hollow when measured against his failures as a father. "So why are you here now? If you wanted to prove you could succeed without me, why stay at my base? Why not request a transfer?" Sarah was quiet for so long that Sullivan wondered if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I'm not doing well, and I don't know how to fix it." The admission seemed to cost her everything. She sat down heavily in the chair, her military posture finally abandoning her. For the first time since she had walked into the hearing room that morning, she looked vulnerable. "The infractions in your record are getting worse. I know. I'm trying, but I can't seem to get it right. I thought military life would be straightforward. Follow orders, complete missions, advance through the ranks. But it's not that simple." Sullivan leaned forward. "What's the problem? I don't trust authority figures. Apparently that's an issue when your entire career depends on following orders from superior officers." The irony in her voice was unmistakable. "My therapist thinks it has something to do with my relationship with my father." The words hung between them like an accusation. Sullivan realized that his daughter's struggles in the military were connected to their relationship, to the ways he had failed her as a father. She had joined to prove herself to him, but the very issues that had driven them apart were now undermining her success. "Sarah, I wanted to hate you," she continued, as if he hadn't spoken. "I wanted to join the military and be better at it than you ever were. I wanted to show you what you missed by not believing in me. But instead, I'm failing at the one thing that was supposed to prove my worth." Sullivan felt something break inside his chest. His daughter, his brilliant, strong, stubborn daughter, was struggling because of wounds he had inflicted. She had joined the military not out of love for service, but out of a desperate need for his approval. And now that same need was destroying her career. "You're not failing," he said quietly. "The infractions say otherwise. The infractions are symptoms. They're not who you are." Sarah looked at him with skepticism. "And how would you know who I am?" You haven't spoken to me in 3 years. It was a fair question, and one Sullivan didn't have a good answer for. How could he know who his daughter had become when he had been too proud and too stubborn to find out? How could he help her navigate military life when he had never successfully navigated their relationship? But looking at her now, seeing the combination of strength and vulnerability that had always defined her, Sullivan realized that maybe knowing who she was wasn't about the years they had missed. Maybe it was about remembering who she had always been and recognizing how that person was trying to survive in an environment that demanded conformity and unquestioning obedience. I know you're struggling with authority because you've always been independent. I know you're having trouble with regulations because you've always questioned rules that don't make sense to you. And I know you're frustrated because you've always expected more from yourself than anyone else ever could. Sarah's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. You can't fix this with a psychological profile, Dad. The word dad hit Sullivan harder than any promotion or medal ever had. It was the first time she had called him that since their fight, and it carried with it the weight of everything they had both lost. I know I can't fix it, but maybe we can figure it out together. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm not offering special treatment. I'm offering to be your father. The distinction mattered, and Sullivan could see that Sarah understood it. She wasn't asking for military favors or career advantages. She was asking for something much more complex and much more important. She was asking for a relationship that could exist alongside their military identities without being destroyed by them. I don't know how to do that, Sarah admitted. Neither do I, Sullivan said. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we can learn together. The conversation in Sullivan's office stretched well past normal duty hours. Outside, the base was transitioning to its evening rhythm, the sounds of training exercises giving way to quieter administrative activities, mess hall service, and the preparation for night watch rotations. Inside the office, father and daughter sat across from each other, navigating a conversation that was 3 years overdue. Sullivan had always been more comfortable with military briefings than personal conversations, but something about Sarah's admission of vulnerability had shifted the dynamic between them. She was no longer the angry teenager who had stormed out of his life, and he was trying not to be the distant father whose criticism had driven her away. They were both different people now, shaped by years of separation and their own struggles with identity and purpose. Tell me about basic training, Sullivan said, genuinely curious about his daughter's experience in the world that had defined his own life. Sarah's expression softened slightly. It was harder than I expected, not the physical part. I had prepared for that. It was the mental adjustment, learning to follow orders without question, to suppress individual thinking in favor of unit cohesion. Everything I had been taught to value, critical thinking, independence, questioning authority, suddenly became obstacles to overcome. That's the hardest part for a lot of recruits. The military requires a different mindset. But you never had trouble with it, did you? Mum told me stories about your early career. You were the model soldier from day one. Sullivan considered the question carefully. I was different when I joined. I came from a family where military service was expected, where following orders and respecting hierarchy were values I learned at home. You came from a family where questioning authority and thinking for yourself were values I tried to teach you, even if I didn't always model them well. So I'm fighting against my own upbringing to succeed in the military. In some ways, yes. But that's not necessarily a weakness. The military needs critical thinkers too. The challenge is learning when to think and when to follow, when to question and when to trust. Sarah nodded, but Sullivan could see she was still struggling with the concept. My drill sergeant used to say that the military breaks you down to build you back up, but what if what they're building isn't compatible with who you are? It was a profound question, and one that Sullivan had never had to confront in his own career. He had adapted to military life so seamlessly that he had never considered whether the process had changed him in ways that weren't entirely positive. Looking at his relationship with Sarah, he was beginning to wonder if his military success had come at a personal cost he had been too focused to recognize. Maybe the goal isn't to become someone different, he said slowly. Maybe it's to learn how to be yourself within the military structure. Is that what you did? Sullivan was quiet for a long moment.
I thought I did.
But looking back, I think I might have become the military instead of learning to serve while remaining myself. I think that's part of why our relationship suffered. The admission surprised them both. Sullivan had spent decades convinced that his military identity was his true self, that the discipline and dedication required by his career were expressions of his deepest values. But sitting across from his daughter, he realized that the person who had become a general might have lost touch with the person who had wanted to be a father. Do you regret it? Sarah asked. The choices you made? I regret the cost. I regret the things I missed. The ways I failed you and your mother, but I can't regret serving my country or the lives that were saved by decisions I made in the field. The question is whether I could have done both better. Sarah studied his face, and Sullivan had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing him more clearly than he saw himself. What would you do differently?
I would have called you.
3 years ago, after you left, I should have called you the next day. I should have kept calling until you were ready to talk. I let pride and stubbornness keep me from reaching out to my own daughter, and that's a failure that has nothing to do with military service. Why didn't you? Sullivan had asked himself the same question countless times, usually late at night when the base was quiet and he was alone with his thoughts. Because I was afraid you were right. I was afraid that I had chosen the military over my family, and that admitting that would mean facing all the ways I had failed as a father. And now? Now I think maybe you were partially right, but not entirely. I did prioritize my career in ways that hurt our relationship. But I also think I can be both a good soldier and a good father if I'm willing to work at it. Sarah leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since she had entered his office, she looked relaxed. I joined the military partly because I was angry at you, but also because I wanted to understand what was so important that it took precedence over everything else in your life. What have you learned? That serving your country is important, but it's not the only important thing. That following orders is necessary, but blind obedience can be dangerous. That military discipline can make you stronger, but it can also make you rigid in ways that aren't always helpful. Sullivan nodded. These were lessons he was still learning himself. What else? That I'm more like you than I wanted to admit. I care about doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. I want to serve something bigger than myself. I just struggle with the parts of military life that require me to stop thinking and start following. Those parts are important too, but not all the time. A good soldier knows when to follow orders without question, and when to think critically about the situation. The best leaders are people who can do both. Sarah smiled for the first time since their conversation began. Is that what you're trying to teach me? How to be a good soldier? I'm trying to figure out how to be your father while also being your commanding officer. I'm not sure it's possible to separate those roles completely. The comment brought them back to the reality of their situation. Sarah was under Sullivan's command, subject to his authority and potentially his discipline. The infractions in her record were real, and they couldn't be ignored simply because she was his daughter. But the traditional approach to military discipline, punishment designed to enforce conformity, might not be what Sarah needed. About the hearing, Sullivan said carefully. The infractions are serious and they need to be addressed. Sarah's military posture returned immediately. I understand, sir. But I think the standard approach might not be effective in your case. Instead of formal discipline, I want to try something different. Sir, you're going to report to me every morning at 05:30 for additional training and counseling. Not as punishment, but as development. We're going to work on the issues that are causing the infractions. Sarah looked skeptical. That sounds like special treatment. It's individualized development, which is part of good leadership. Every soldier is different, and effective commanders adapt their approach to meet the needs of their personnel.
And if people talk?
If they say I'm getting special treatment because I'm the general's daughter? Sullivan had considered this problem. Military units were small communities where rumors spread quickly and perceptions mattered. If Sarah was seen as receiving favoritism, it would undermine both her credibility and his leadership. But he also believed that addressing her specific needs was more important than avoiding gossip. Let them talk. Your performance will speak for itself. If this approach helps you become a better soldier, that's what matters. What if it doesn't work? What if I can't adapt to military life? The question hung between them, representing Sarah's deepest fear and Sullivan's greatest concern. What if, despite their efforts to repair their relationship and address her struggles, Sarah simply wasn't suited for military life? What if helping her meant acknowledging that she needed to find a different path? Then we'll figure out what comes next. But let's try this first. Sarah nodded slowly. What kind of additional training? Leadership exercises, scenario planning, discussions about military history and decision-making. I want to help you understand not just what orders to follow, but why certain orders exist and how to evaluate them critically while still maintaining discipline. That sounds more like officer training than enlisted development. Sullivan smiled. Maybe that's because I think you have the potential to be an officer. You have the intelligence, the analytical skills, and the commitment to service. You just need to learn how to channel those qualities within military structure. The suggestion clearly surprised Sarah. I never considered officer training. Why not? Because I joined to prove I could succeed in your world, not to become you. Being an officer, doesn't mean becoming me. It means becoming the best version of yourself in service to your country. Sarah was quiet, considering the implications. Officer training would mean additional commitment to military service, additional responsibility, and additional challenges. But it would also mean opportunities to use the critical thinking skills that had been obstacles in her enlisted service. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Take all the time you need. For now, let's focus on addressing the immediate issues and rebuilding the foundation we need for whatever comes next." Sarah stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Dad." "Thank you for listening, for being willing to try something different. I know this isn't easy for you either. It's the most important thing I'll do as your commanding officer. What about as my father?" Sullivan smiled. "As your father, the most important thing is making sure you know I love you and I'm proud of you, regardless of what uniform you wear." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she didn't try to hide them. "I love you too, Dad. I always have, even when I was too angry to say it." After she left, Sullivan remained in his office well into the evening, staring out the window at the base he commanded. Somewhere out there, his daughter was probably dealing with the same questions and uncertainties that had brought them to this conversation. Tomorrow, they would begin the difficult work of rebuilding their relationship while navigating the complex demands of military service. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Sullivan felt hopeful. He had found his daughter again, not as the angry young woman who had left home, but as the strong, thoughtful, complicated person she had become. And maybe, with time and effort, he could learn to be both the father she needed and the commanding officer she deserved. The morning sessions between Sullivan and Sarah began 3 days later. At precisely 5:30, as the base was still shrouded in pre-dawn darkness, Sarah knocked on her father's office door. She had spent the intervening days completing her regular duties while word of the postponed disciplinary hearing spread through the rumor mill that existed in every military installation. Sullivan had anticipated the gossip. In the close-knit environment of a military base, any deviation from normal procedure attracted attention, and the sudden postponement of a routine disciplinary hearing had not gone unnoticed. He had already fielded subtle inquiries from his senior staff, carefully worded questions about whether there were complications with the Rodriguez case. His responses had been appropriately vague, citing the need for thorough review, but he knew that speculation would continue. What he hadn't anticipated was how difficult it would be to shift between his roles as father and commanding officer. During their evening conversation, they had found a delicate balance that allowed them to be honest about their relationship while respecting the military context. But in the harsh, fluorescent light of his office at dawn, with Sarah standing at attention in full uniform, the weight of their dual roles felt more complex. "At ease, Private," Sullivan said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "This isn't a formal session. We're here to work through the issues that led to the infractions in your record." Sarah relaxed slightly but remained clearly uncomfortable. "What did you want to start with, sir?" Sullivan had spent considerable time planning their first session. He had reviewed Sarah's service record in detail, consulted with military psychologists about authority issues among young soldiers, and even called Margaret to gain insight into how Sarah had been coping with military life. The picture that emerged was of a young woman with enormous potential who was struggling to find her place within institutional hierarchy. "I want to understand what happened the night of your first curfew violation. Walk me through your thought process." "I was working on a communications project. There was a problem with the radio equipment that I thought I could solve if I had more time to troubleshoot it. I knew curfew was approaching, but I believed that completing the repair was more important than following the time restriction. So you made a judgment call." "Yes, sir." "And when you were discovered out of bounds after curfew?" "I explained the situation to the duty officer. I showed him the work I had completed and the progress I had made on the repair. I thought he would understand that I was trying to solve a problem that would affect unit operations." Sullivan nodded. The scenario was familiar to anyone who had supervised young soldiers with initiative and intelligence. Sarah had identified a legitimate problem, applied her technical skills to address it, and prioritized mission accomplishment over strict adherence to regulations. In many contexts, this kind of independent thinking was exactly what the military needed. What was the duty officer's response? He said that following orders was more important than individual initiative. He said that if everyone decided which rules to follow based on their personal judgment, military discipline would collapse.
"Do you think he was wrong?" Sarah paused, clearly wrestling with the question.
"Logically, I understand his point. Military effectiveness depends on everyone following the same standards and procedures. But in this specific situation, I believe my judgment was correct. The equipment repair was completed successfully, and it prevented a communications failure during the next day's training exercise. So you were right about the technical problem, but wrong about the procedural approach. I suppose so, but that's what I don't understand about military life. If my judgment was sound and my results were positive, why is the fact that I violated curfew more important than the fact that I solved the problem? Sullivan leaned back in his chair, recognizing the fundamental tension that Sarah was articulating. She was asking one of the deepest questions about military service. When does adherence to rules serve the mission, and when does it hinder it? It was a question that had challenged military theorists for centuries, and it was particularly difficult for intelligent, independent thinkers, because military effectiveness isn't just about individual competence, it's about collective reliability. If every soldier decided independently which orders to follow, even with good intentions, the result would be chaos. But doesn't that approach discourage exactly the kind of critical thinking that leads to innovation and adaptation? Sullivan smiled despite himself. Sarah's question was precisely the kind of analytical challenge that made her both a valuable soldier and a difficult subordinate. She was thinking like an officer, questioning assumptions and examining the logical foundations of military procedure. But she was doing it as an enlisted soldier, in a context that required different behavior. It can, yes. That's why the military has different expectations for different ranks and roles. Enlisted soldiers are expected to follow orders and implement decisions made by their superiors. Officers are expected to make those decisions, which requires the kind of critical analysis you're describing. So the problem isn't that I think too much, it's that I'm thinking at the wrong level for my current rank. Exactly. And that's why I suggested you consider officer training. Your analytical skills are assets, but they need to be applied in the right context. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications. Sullivan could see her working through the logic, applying the same systematic thinking that had gotten her into trouble to the question of how to redirect her approach. What about the other infractions? She asked finally. The uniform inspection failure and the tardiness to formation? Sullivan consulted her file. Tell me about those incidents. The uniform inspection was because I had modified my equipment for better functionality. I had reorganized my pack to make essential items more accessible and adjusted the fit of my gear for improved mobility. The modifications were based on research I had done about optimal load distribution and equipment configuration. But they weren't standard. No, sir. There were improvements, but they weren't authorized improvements. And the tardiness? I was helping another soldier with a personal problem. She was dealing with a family crisis and needed someone to talk to. I knew I would be late for formation, but I believed that supporting a fellow soldier was the right thing to do. Sullivan could see the pattern clearly now. Each infraction stemmed from Sarah's tendency to prioritize what she perceived as the right thing to do over strict adherence to regulations. She was making decisions based on her values and judgment rather than on institutional requirements. It wasn't malicious or lazy. It was the behavior of someone who saw rules as guidelines to be evaluated rather than absolute commands to be obeyed. Do you see the common thread in these situations? I'm making independent judgments instead of following established procedures. And do you understand why that's problematic in a military context? Sarah nodded slowly. Because military effectiveness depends on predictability and coordination. If everyone operates according to their individual judgment, the system breaks down. But do you accept that principle, or do you just understand it intellectually? The question was crucial, and Sullivan could see that Sarah recognized its importance. Understanding why military discipline was necessary was different from accepting it as legitimate. She could acknowledge the logic of institutional hierarchy while still believing that her individual judgment was superior to established procedures. I'm trying to accept it, Sarah said finally, but it's difficult. When I see problems that could be solved or people who need help, my instinct is to act, not to wait for permission or follow channels. That instinct is valuable, but it needs to be channeled properly. Military leadership is about learning when to act on your judgment and when to follow established procedures. It's about understanding which situations require independent thinking and which require strict adherence to protocols. How do you learn that distinction? Sullivan considered the question carefully. It was one of the most important aspects of military development, and it couldn't be taught through regulations or classroom instruction. It required experience, mentorship, and the kind of judgment that came from understanding both the letter and the spirit of military service, through practice, feedback, and gradually increasing responsibility. That's what we're going to work on in these sessions. I'm going to give you scenarios that require you to think through the balance between individual judgment and institutional requirements. What kind of scenarios? Situations where you have to decide whether to follow orders that don't make sense. How to handle conflicts between personal values and military requirements. When to take initiative and when to wait for direction. We're going to practice the kind of decision-making that officers face every day.
Sarah's eyes brightened with interest. That sounds like leadership training.
It is leadership training.
Because whether or not you choose to pursue a commission, you need to understand how leadership thinking applies to your current role. Over the following weeks, their morning sessions developed a rhythm. Sullivan would present Sarah with increasingly complex scenarios drawn from his own experience and military history. They would analyze the situation together, examine the competing factors that influence decision-making, and discuss how different choices might affect both mission accomplishment and personnel welfare. The scenarios ranged from tactical situations to administrative challenges to ethical dilemmas. Sarah threw herself into the exercises with the same intensity that had gotten her into trouble. But now her analytical skills were being directed toward understanding military decision-making rather than critiquing military procedures. Sullivan found himself enjoying the sessions more than he had expected. Sarah's questions forced him to examine his own assumptions and articulate the principles that had guided his career. Her fresh perspective challenged conventional thinking in ways that were intellectually stimulating and professionally valuable. But the progress wasn't without complications. Other soldiers on the base had noticed Sarah's special sessions with the general, and rumors about favoritism were beginning to circulate. Sullivan's senior staff had started making subtle comments about the importance of uniform discipline and the dangers of making exceptions to established procedures. The situation came to a head during a weekly staff meeting when Lieutenant Colonel Peterson raised concerns about morale and perception. "Sir, I'm hearing questions from the NCOs about the Rodriguez case. Some of the soldiers are wondering whether disciplinary standards apply equally to everyone." Discourses. Major Williams nodded in agreement. "There's talk about preferential treatment and the message that sends to other personnel who are dealing with their own adjustment issues." Sullivan had been expecting this conversation, but it was still difficult to navigate. He couldn't explain the personal relationship without compromising both his and Sarah's positions. But he also couldn't allow doubt about his fairness and integrity to undermine his leadership. Private Rodriguez is receiving individualized development appropriate to her specific needs and potential. The approach is based on professional assessment of how to best address her performance issues. "But, sir," Peterson pressed, "other soldiers with similar infractions have received standard disciplinary action. The appearance of inequality is affecting unit cohesion." Sullivan felt the weight of competing responsibilities. As a commander, he needed to maintain the confidence and respect of his staff and the soldiers under his command. As a father, he wanted to give Sarah the support and guidance she needed to succeed. As a professional, he believed that effective leadership required adapting approaches to individual circumstances. "I understand your concerns," he said finally. "But I stand by my decision. Private Rodriguez's development plan is appropriate and will continue as designed. If any soldier has specific complaints about fairness or favoritism, they can file a formal complaint through proper channels." The response was firm, but not entirely satisfying. Sullivan could see that his staff remained concerned, and he knew that the rumors would continue to circulate. The challenge was proving that his approach with Sarah was producing positive results, before doubts about his judgment undermined his effectiveness as a commander. That evening, Sullivan called Margaret to discuss the situation. His wife had been following Sarah's progress with intense interest, and she had become an unofficial advisor on how to balance the complex demands of their family relationship with military requirements. "How is she doing?" Margaret asked immediately. "Better. The morning sessions are helping her understand military decision-making. She's starting to see the logic behind procedures that seemed arbitrary before." "And how are you doing?" Sullivan paused. Margaret had a talent for asking the questions that got to the heart of issues he was trying to avoid. "I'm learning too. About leadership, about fatherhood, about how to be both when they seem to conflict." "Are people talking?" "Yes. There are concerns about favoritism and special treatment. Some of my staff think I'm compromising discipline for personal reasons." "Are you?" It was a fair question, and one Sullivan had been asking himself. Was his approach with Sarah based on sound military judgment, or was he allowing his desire to repair their relationship to influence his professional decisions? "I don't think so. I believe that effective leadership requires adapting to individual needs and circumstances. Sarah has different challenges than most soldiers, and she requires a different approach." "But you're also her father." "Yes, and that complicates everything. But I think the approach is working, and I think it's the right thing to do both professionally and personally. Margaret was quiet for a moment. What happens if the criticism gets worse? What if you're forced to choose between protecting your command authority and protecting Sarah? It was the question Sullivan had been dreading because he didn't have a good answer. If doubt about his judgment began to affect his ability to lead effectively, he would have to reconsider his approach. But the thought of returning to traditional disciplinary measures with Sarah, of treating her like any other soldier with infractions, felt like abandoning her when she was finally beginning to find her way. I don't know, he admitted. I'm hoping it doesn't come to that, but even as he said it, Sullivan suspected that the choice Margaret described was coming sooner than he wanted to acknowledge. The crisis Sullivan had been anticipating arrived 6 weeks into Sarah's development program, triggered by an incident that forced all the underlying tensions about fairness, favoritism, and military discipline into the open. It happened during the routine training exercise that went catastrophically wrong, testing not only Sarah's progress but also Sullivan's ability to balance his roles as commander and father. The exercise was designed to simulate communication failures during combat operations. Sarah's unit was responsible for maintaining radio contact between forward positions and command headquarters, a critical function that required both technical expertise and strict adherence to protocol. Sarah had been performing well in the training scenarios, applying the decision-making framework she had learned during her morning sessions with Sullivan. But the simulation included variables that hadn't been anticipated. Equipment failures cascaded into communication blackouts that left field units isolated and vulnerable. Standard procedures called for following predetermined backup protocols, but Sarah recognized that the backup systems had also been compromised by the same technical problems that had caused the initial failures. Faced with a choice between following established procedures that she knew would fail and implementing an unauthorized solution that might restore communications, Sarah made the decision that 6 weeks of training had prepared her for. She analyzed the situation, weighed the competing factors, and chose mission accomplishment over procedural compliance. Working with remarkable speed and technical skill, Sarah bypassed the failed systems and established alternative communication pathways that restored contact between the isolated units and headquarters. Her solution was creative, effective, and completely outside the bounds of authorized procedures. Within 30 minutes, she had turned a simulation disaster into a training success. But her actions had been observed by Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a career NCO who had been watching Sarah's progress with growing skepticism. Rodriguez had served under Sullivan for 2 years and had developed deep respect for the general's leadership, but he had also become increasingly concerned about what he perceived as favoritism in Sarah's case. The sergeant's report was professional but damning. He acknowledged that Private Rodriguez had demonstrated exceptional technical skill and had successfully resolved a critical communication failure. However, he noted that she had violated standing orders, ignored established protocols, and made unauthorized modifications to equipment. In his assessment, her actions represented exactly the kind of independent decision-making that undermined military discipline. The report landed on Sullivan's desk the following morning, accompanied by a formal complaint signed by 6 NCOs requesting that Private Rodriguez be subject to standard disciplinary procedures. The complaint didn't mention Sarah's relationship to Sullivan, but it made clear that the perception of special treatment was affecting unit morale and the credibility of the chain of command. Sullivan read the documents with growing dread, recognizing that the moment Margaret had warned him about had arrived. He could continue to shield Sarah from standard military discipline, but doing so would undermine his authority and potentially compromise the effectiveness of his command. Or he could treat her like any other soldier, which would mean formal disciplinary action that could end her military career. But there was a third option that hadn't occurred to him until he reviewed the sergeant's report more carefully. Sarah's actions during the exercise weren't just violations of protocol, they were also demonstrations of exactly the kind of leadership thinking that he had been trying to develop through their morning sessions. She had faced a complex situation, analyzed the available options, and made a decision that prioritized mission accomplishment while accepting personal risk. That afternoon, Sullivan called a meeting with his senior staff to address the complaints about Private Rodriguez. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson, Major Williams, and the senior NCOs who had signed the complaint were present, along with Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had filed the initial report. "I've reviewed the incident from yesterday's training exercise," Sullivan began, "and I want to discuss the broader issues it raises about discipline, leadership development, and fairness." The room was tense. Everyone present knew that Sullivan's handling of the Rodriguez case had become a test of his leadership and judgment. His response would signal whether he was willing to maintain military standards or would compromise discipline for personal reasons. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, please summarize your observations from the exercise. The sergeant stood and delivered a crisp report. Private Rodriguez demonstrated exceptional technical competence but violated established protocols. Her unauthorized actions achieved the desired result but set a precedent that could undermine adherence to standard procedures. And your recommendation? Formal disciplinary action consistent with previous cases involving unauthorized deviation from established protocols. Sullivan nodded. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson, what's your assessment? Peterson's response was carefully diplomatic. The private's technical skills are impressive, but military effectiveness depends on predictable adherence to authorized procedures. The appearance of different standards for different personnel affects unit cohesion. Major Williams? I agree that consistency and discipline is important for maintaining morale and trust in the chain of command. Sullivan could see that his staff expected him to announce standard disciplinary action for Sarah. The weight of their expectations, combined with the formal complaint from the NCOs, created pressure to demonstrate that he could separate his personal relationships from his professional responsibilities. Instead, he made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. I'm recommending Private Rodriguez for accelerated promotion to specialist and immediate enrollment in officer candidate school. The silence that followed was profound. Peterson's mouth actually fell open. Major Williams blinked as if she hadn't heard correctly. Master Sergeant Rodriguez looked like he was trying to process information that didn't fit any category he understood. Sir, Peterson managed finally, Private Rodriguez's actions during the exercise demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical thinking, independent judgment, and mission-focused decision-making that we need in our officer corps. She identified system failures that hadn't been anticipated by the exercise designers, developed creative solutions under pressure, and successfully restored critical communications capabilities. But sir, she violated established protocols. Yes, she did. And her willingness to accept personal risk in order to accomplish the mission is precisely the quality that distinguishes leaders from followers. She made an officer-level decision while serving in an enlisted capacity. Sullivan could see that his staff was struggling to understand his logic. From their perspective, he was rewarding behavior that undermined military discipline. But from Sullivan's perspective, Sarah had demonstrated that the development program was working. She had learned to balance independent judgment with institutional requirements, and she had applied that learning in exactly the way that effective officers must. The development program I implemented for Private Rodriguez was designed to prepare her for leadership responsibilities. Yesterday's exercise proved that the program has been successful. She's ready for the next level of military service. Master Sergeant Rodriguez raised his hand. Sir, with respect, if we promote soldiers for violating orders, what message does that send to personnel who followed procedures? It was a legitimate question, and Sullivan had anticipated it. Sergeant, what we're recognizing is the difference between blind obedience and intelligent leadership. Private Rodriguez didn't violate orders because she was undisciplined or rebellious. She made a calculated decision to prioritize mission accomplishment over procedural compliance, and she was prepared to accept the consequences of that decision. But how do we distinguish between justified deviation and simple insubordination? Through the kind of individualized assessment and development that we've been providing. Not every soldier needs the same approach, and not every situation requires the same response. Effective leadership means recognizing potential and providing the training necessary to develop it. Sullivan could see that his explanation was beginning to make sense to his staff, though they remained skeptical about the broader implications. The conversation continued for another hour, with detailed discussion about leadership development, disciplinary consistency, and the balance between individual initiative and institutional requirements. But the real test would be Sarah's response to his decision. That evening, Sullivan called her to his office to explain what had happened and what it meant for her future.
You're recommending me for officer candidate school?
Sarah's voice reflected disbelief and excitement in equal measure. Based on your performance during the exercise and your progress in our development sessions, yes, you've demonstrated that you can think like an officer while maintaining the discipline necessary for effective military service. What about the complaints? The concerns about favoritism? Sullivan had decided to be completely honest with Sarah about the challenges they had faced and the perception issues that had surrounded her case. Those concerns were legitimate, and they forced me to examine whether my approach was based on sound professional judgment or personal bias. And I concluded that both were involved, but that the professional judgment was sound. You needed a different kind of development than most soldiers, and providing that development was the right thing to do as your commanding officer. Even though it created problems for you, leadership isn't about avoiding problems. It's about making decisions that serve the long-term interests of the organization and the people in it. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of the opportunity being offered to her. Officer Candidate School would mean additional months of intensive training, followed by years of increased responsibility and commitment. It would also mean validation of the path she had chosen, and recognition that her struggles had been transformed into strengths. "I accept," she said finally, "but I have one condition." Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "You're in no position to make conditions, Private." Sarah smiled. "I want to complete the program on my own merit, with no special assistance or accommodation because of our relationship. If I can't succeed as an officer candidate based on my own abilities, then I don't deserve the commission." "Agreed. But you should know that Officer Candidate School will be more challenging than anything you've experienced so far. The physical demands, the academic requirements, and the leadership expectations are all designed to push candidates to their limits." "I understand. And Dad?" Sarah paused, switching from her military voice to her personal one. "Thank you, not just for the recommendation, but for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Sullivan felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever Sarah called him Dad. "You earned this opportunity through your own growth and effort. I just provided the framework. We both know it was more than that. You risked your reputation and your authority to give me a chance to find my place in the military. That's not something I'll forget." 6 months later, Sullivan stood in the audience at the Officer Candidate School graduation ceremony, watching his daughter receive her commission as a second lieutenant. Sarah had completed the program with distinction, earning high marks for leadership, academic performance, and military bearing. More importantly, she had found her place within the military structure, learning to balance her analytical nature with the institutional requirements of military service. The ceremony was held outdoors on a crisp autumn day, with hundreds of family members gathered to witness the transformation of their loved ones from candidates to officers. Sullivan had attended many such ceremonies throughout his career, but this one felt different. He was watching not just as a general observing the next generation of military leaders, but as a father seeing his daughter achieve something that had once seemed impossible. Margaret sat beside him, tears streaming down her face as Sarah raised her right hand and took the oath of office. The 3 years of silence, the months of struggle and conflict, the weeks of uncertainty about whether their relationship could survive the challenges of military service, all of it led to this moment of pride and completion. After the ceremony, Sullivan and Margaret waited as Sarah spoke with her classmates and instructors, accepting congratulations and making plans for her first assignment. When she finally approached them, she was no longer the angry young woman who had left home 3 years ago, or the struggling enlisted soldier who had faced disciplinary action. She was a confident, capable officer, ready to begin the next phase of her service. "So what happens now?" Margaret asked. "Now I go to Fort Benning for my first assignment as a platoon leader," Sarah replied. "I'll be responsible for 30 soldiers and their training and welfare." "Are you nervous?" Sullivan asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "Excited more than nervous. I understand now what you tried to tell me years ago about the responsibility that comes with military service. It's not just about following orders or advancing your career. It's about the people you serve with and the mission you're committed to accomplishing." Sullivan nodded. "That's the heart of military leadership. Everything else is just procedure and protocol." "Will I see you often?" Sarah asked, and Sullivan could hear the concern in her voice.
"As often as our assignments allow."
"But Sarah, you're an officer now. You'll be making your own decisions, leading your own soldiers, building your own reputation. What matters isn't how often we see each other, but that we've learned how to be both a military family and a real family." Sarah smiled and hugged both her parents. "I think we have." As they walked away from the ceremony, Sullivan reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The morning he had first recognized Sarah in the disciplinary hearing had seemed like a crisis that threatened both their relationship and his career. But it had actually been an opportunity to discover new ways of balancing competing responsibilities and loyalties. He had learned that being a father and being a commanding officer weren't mutually exclusive roles, but they required different skills and different approaches. Most importantly, he had learned that true leadership meant recognizing the potential in people and providing them with the support they needed to achieve it, even when that support challenged conventional approaches. Sarah had found her place in the military not by abandoning her independent nature, but by learning how to channel it effectively. She had discovered that questioning authority and following orders weren't opposites, but different tools that could be used appropriately in different situations. And they had both learned that family relationships, like military service, required commitment, sacrifice, and the willingness to adapt when circumstances demanded change. The story that had begun with a general freezing, in recognition of his estranged daughter, had become something much more complex and meaningful. It had become a story about the possibility of redemption, the importance of second chances, and the ways that love and duty could support each other, rather than compete. As Sullivan watched his daughter, Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez, disappear into her new life as a military officer, he felt the kind of pride that had nothing to do with rank or achievement, and everything to do with watching someone you love become the person they were meant to be. The stand-down order that had begun their reconciliation had ultimately become a stand-up moment that transformed them both.